Jack's Restaurant was owned by my great-grandfather, John Dunston, also called Jack Dunston. And he first worked at the restaurant in the late 1800s as a waiter, and got in an argument with the owner and was fired. And he told the owner that in a few years he'd be back and he would be fired because he would be the new owner.
Right.
And that came to pass. And so Jack's Restaurant goes back to the late 1890s as Jack's Restaurant.
As Jack's Restaurant.
It was called something else before.
All right.
And it was his restaurant until he closed it in the 20s when he finally decided that enough was enough.
Jack's Restaurant was my grandfather's restaurant, and it was very popular in those days. And it had a big dining room for the family, 103 West 43rd Street. And that was sort of the family part of it. And it had two tables on each, tables on each side of the dining room with very fancy pictures over everything. Great big pictures, like 6 by 9 maybe.
Okay, wow.
Yeah. Yeah, I used to go there from the time I was, say, 5 or 6, and have dinner with Margaret, who was just taking care of me.
If somebody got out of control and wouldn't quiet down, he had some rather burly waiters, and they would escort the person to one of the doors, and it was called the Flying Wedge, and they would pick up and heave the person out the door onto the side. And there are a lot of stories and a lot of things in print about the Flying Wedge, and about Yale or Harvard or Princeton football players coming to get a drink and getting carried away and getting heaved out the door with the Flying Wedge. When Jack's Restaurant is talked about in the papers, it's rare that the Flying Wedge somehow doesn't come up in the story.
Right.
No, it was famous for that.
And the men used to gather in there after football games, and then they got too rowdy, and then Grandpa would throw them out. And he had two big guys that had been ex-prize fighters, and they'd take them and put them in the elevator that went around like that, and they'd end up on 6th Avenue.
I see.
And then they'd get themselves up, and they'd come around to the 103 and try to get in again, and Grandpa would be there waiting for them, and he let them in if they promised to behave.
I see.
And then they would promise to behave, and sometimes they did, and of course sometimes they didn't, and then they didn't get a second chance. It's just a one chance to get in. And Grandpa had a lot of fun with this, I think. Anyway, that was that.
And he lived up above the restaurant, and the supply of liquor was up there as well. And of course, during Prohibition, he obviously had a problem, and he was accused ultimately of supplying illegal booze, illegal because of Prohibition. 1,200 bottles or Johnny Walker or Red Label or something, just huge amounts of liquor.
And that's what the police came in in Prohibition and said that he was selling it, and he said he wasn't, that possibly the waiters were putting it in the teacups and things, and possibly he knew all about that too.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Teacups, and so they got liquor in the teacups. But then there were two very famous men that raided all the restaurants and got them arrested and so on. And when Grandpa came up for the weekend to Millerton, Mother said, "Papa, you must be careful because they're going to raid you next." They said they're going to raid a famous restaurant. So, of course they did.
And then
Mother got this young lawyer, George Donnellan, to try to get everything back. And Grandpa was wild. They got it out of his place there. And then he was a very smart young lawyer, and he beat them. They said the lawyer for the governor or whatever he was started yelling at Grandpa, and saying, "Did you do this, do that," thing. And Grandpa said, "Young man, are you trying to confuse me?" Because obviously he was,
Right.
And the whole courtroom burst out laughing. And "Don't try to confuse me, young man." And of course, from then on, the lawyer was sort of, he was through.
Yeah, took the wind out of his sails, yeah.
His Grandpa said it in a very commanding voice, "You try, And so from then on, of course, the audience all laughed and clapped and things. And so Grandpa, of course, won the case. And
Right.
the liquor was all brought back. When it was brought back, he stood out in front of 103 and washed it in. They said, "What do you intend to do with all this liquor if you didn't sell it? There's prohibition." He said, "I intend to drink it before I die." And they said, "It's an awful lot of liquor you drink." He said, "That's all right. It's from Ireland, and I'll drink it." Of course, he never did. It was, New York Times and Herald had Jack Dunstan says he's going to drink 25 cases or whatever it was of Irish whiskey before he dies, and he watched it all go back in, and he was very annoyed because some of it was water.
Really?
They'd opened it and taken the Irish whiskey and just filled the bottle with water. Oh, it was wrong. Got it back, but didn't get it back. Oh boy, the scoundrels, he said.
Scoundrels.
Yeah. Yeah, he was a good-looking man, about 6 feet tall, and gray hair and a white mustache. He got his point out, and you did. I remember doing everything that he said. I took it quite seriously. Because he was very kind.
He was born in 1853 near Skibbereen, Ireland, and he died in 1927, Christmas 1927. But he was a very, full of the old blarney. I mean, Irish to the core. He was, came over to find his fortune, and when he was like 18 or something, and somehow I think first landed up in Newfoundland or St. John, and that's where he met his wife, and then made his way to New York and started working, as a waiter, and then ultimately took over the restaurant, named it Jack. I don't think it really was named officially Jack's. It was just one of those things. Well, what are you calling it? Well, it's Jack's or something.
It just happened that way.
Just happened that way.
I see.
Yeah.